What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. There is a very strange moment happening inside Russia right now. And if you only follow the official speeches, the battlefield maps, or the usual Kremlin propaganda, typical YouTube videos, you may have completely missed it. Because the biggest political danger to Putin today is not necessarily coming from some traditional opposition figure, not even from the Western sanctions alone, and not even from a clean battlefield defeat, but from the exact world Putin himself created, radicalized, armed, and then convinced that this war could continue forever without ever coming back to Moscow. That is why the story of Alexander Lunin matters so much today, because on the surface he looks like just another loud social media personality making dramatic videos and claims online. But once you look deeper, his rise tells us something much larger about Russia's internal condition, about Russian mutiny, about the public mood, and about the slow collapse of the illusion that Putin can simply outlast Ukraine, Europe, America, sanctions, and outlast the Russian people themselves. In his new video, Lunin directly demands that Putin listens to him, because according to him, he can explain what is really happening inside the military ranks. And if Putin refuses, Lunin warns that the Kremlin could face an armed revolution from the very people who were supposed to be the backbone of the war effort. He talks about soldiers being trapped in punishment basements, commanders abusing their own men, and people in uniform being treated not like heroes or defenders of the state, but like disposable material that can be sent forward, forgotten, and then replaced when the next shortage appears.
Вчера со мной встретились люди, представители высоких чинов Министерства обороны, силовых структур, и передали сообщение Владимиру Владимировичу Путину.
And the shocking part is not only that he said it, because complaints from the Russian military are not new, but that millions of regular Russian people watched it, shared it, discussed it, and treated him not like some random character yelling into the void, but like someone who suddenly gave words to feelings that many Russians were already carrying inside them. For years, the entire strategy was built on two pillars. Ordinary Russian civilians would pretend the war did not really exist, and then the Russian manpower pool would keep feeding the front without asking too many questions. But now, both of those pillars are cracking at the same time. And when a system built on silence begins to hear its own supporters speak in a language of anger, betrayal, and revenge, that is exactly when the real political problem begins. But let me tell you what. If you guys do not want to have problems watching these episodes at your own time, not when they just go live on YouTube, please consider checking our Patreon, because every episode is uploaded there 10 hours before it appears on YouTube. And there's also an additional chapter at the end. The link to our Patreon is down below. Thanks so much. Now let's begin. People look at Putin's system and assume that because it has survived for so long, it must be designed to survive forever, when in reality, every authoritarian structure looks permanent right until the moment its hidden weaknesses become impossible to hide. After the quick blitzkrieg on Kiev failed, the Kremlin settled into a much darker theory of victory, and that theory was kinda rather simple. That is that Putin just could simply afford a long war, while Ukraine and the West could not. The message to Ukraine's Western allies was basically this. You have public fatigue, inflation, scandals, changing governments, and leaders who eventually have to leave the office, while Putin has none of those problems, because he can stay in power as long as he wants. If the war lasts 1, 5 years, or 10 years, the Kremlin believed it could simply wait until Western politics got tired. That argument was not even completely ridiculous. I mean, just take a look what's happening right now, which is exactly why it became so influential. Because American presidents come and go, European coalitions can collapse, voters can shift their attention somewhere else, most likely inside their own countries. And politicians who sound much closer to Putin's worldview can already win elections by promising to cut aid to Ukraine, focus on domestic issues, and just in general, stop caring about Ukraine. At the same time, the Kremlin was sending another message to Ukraine itself. Russia can make your cities live under constant pressure, your homes can go dark, and your society can be exhausted, while Moscow, Penza, Chelyabinsk and Yekaterinburg continue going to work, watching television, and leaving as if the war is just another background noise topic on the evening news. That was the psychological foundation of the entire war. Ukraine was supposed to feel it every day, while most Russians were supposed to feel absolutely nothing. And as long as that remained true, the Kremlin couldn't tell inside that time was it. Kremlin could tell itself that time was on its side. But here's the problem with that theory. It only works while the war stays contained. It only works while fuel keeps flowing, drones do not reach deeper inside Russia, while the budget still looks manageable, and while the public still believes that the price of the war is being paid by someone else. Once those conditions begin to disappear, the entire concept of Putin's endless time begins to look less like a strategy and more like a delay tactic. And that brings us to the first major crack in the foundation. Now here is the most ironic part, because for a long time the Kremlin could describe the war as something happening somewhere else, in places with names most Russians only heard on television probably once in their lives. But that separation becomes harder to maintain when Ukraine's drones start reaching deep into Russian territory and striking the infrastructure that keeps daily life running. The earlier drone incident near the Kremlin could be dismissed by Russian propaganda as just symbolic, dramatic, but limited, just one-time event in the whole war, something the state could absorb and explain away, while the current pressure on Russia's oil refinery infrastructure is completely different, because it is not just about symbolism, but about the physical systems that keep the country moving. Ukraine has been consistently targeting Russian refineries, and the deeper problem for Moscow is not just that one plant gets damaged, or that, 3 out of Russia's 39 refineries are affected, or even that 10 damaged refineries would be much more difficult to explain, but that the trend itself destroys the comfort zone Putin needed to maintain. If drones can keep coming, if they can pressure oil refineries again and again, then the Kremlin can no longer honestly claim that Konstantinivka or any other small village feels the war while Ryazan does not, or that Ukraine lives under the threat while Central Russia simply watches from a safe distance. There are already fuel rationings purchased from Belarus and Kazakhstan, and the fact that in Russia's Far East people may be limited to buying only 14 liters of fuel, which sounds like a technical detail until you understand what it means politically. Fuel is not just fuel. Fuel is also logistics, deliveries, agriculture, military transport, and the feeling that the state can no longer protect the basic machinery of ordinary life. If enough gas stations run dry, or if refinery operations stall across important regions, then no number of paid bloggers, television speeches, or patriotic slogans can ever convince people that everything is under control. This is why the report that Russia's Ministry of Defense supposedly shot down 660 drones matters, because even if we do not treat every official number as reliable, the scale itself of the claim tells us something important, is that Ukraine is dramatically expanding its drone and missile pressure, and Russian air defenses are being stretched across a geography that is simply too large to protect. Today the target may be a refinery. Tomorrow it could be a manufacturing facility, power plant, a transport infrastructure that suddenly makes the war feel much closer to people who once thought it belonged only to television. This does not mean that Ukraine controls the rhythm of Russian life everywhere, but it does mean that nobody can be certain anymore that a 5 or 10-year war will leave Moscow completely untouched. And once that certainty disappears, the next question becomes completely unavoidable. Who is still willing to feed the system with manpower when everyone can see that the price is rising? The next part is where most people mess up because they hear about large recruitment bonuses in Russia and just assume that the Kremlin can always solve manpower shortages by continuously raising the price. When in reality, there comes a point where even money stops working, because the job being offered has become too dangerous, too dishonest, and people just became too well understood and informed what is happening. For a long time, Putin tried to avoid another large mobilization drive by turning recruitment into a market transaction, offering enormous signing bonuses, sometimes worth several times a normal annual salary, especially in poorer regions where debt, low wages, and limited opportunities made the offer look tempting. This did help the Kremlin maintain the appearance of normal life, because if people signed contracts voluntarily, then Moscow could pretend there was no national crisis, no panic, and no reason for ordinary families to worry unless they personally chose to participate. But the market has fundamentals that propaganda cannot erase. It's just, once again, economics, politics 101. If the offer is basically large money in exchange for a high chance of being sent to brutal assault conditions, that at some point the people who were willing to take that deal, have already taken it. And the people desperate enough to at least consider it have already heard the stories and changed their minds. And the people still available understand that phrases like truck driver and rear operations may not mean what the advertisement suggests. There is no more low-hanging fruit. The early contract soldiers are already in the system, many former convicts who could have been used have already been pulled in, the original invasion force has already been heavily worn down, and the pool of potential people who can be recruited quietly without disturbing society is shrinking significantly. Yes, Russia is a huge country, and yes, some people will continue signing, especially people with debts, limited options, or the belief that the money can solve problems for their families. But the casualty rate on the battlefield is higher than the system's ability to quietly replace people forever. That is elementary math, and elementary math is one of the few things that even authoritarian propaganda cannot defeat. If losses continue, if recruitment does not match the pace, and if the state still wants to continue the same war, then the shortage has to be filled somehow. Which means pressure, roundups, regional coercion, and eventually the kind of mobilization anxiety the Kremlin has been trying to avoid since 2022. This is why the mention of Penza, the city, matters so much, because when street-level pressure begins in one place, people elsewhere immediately understand that it can spread. A man in the same, once again, Penza, Chelyabinsk, Moscow, or Ekaterinburg may not care about the war when it's happening to someone else in some other region. But he will care very quickly when draft officers, police, or recruiters begin treating his own life as a part of the state reserve inventory, or worse when drones appear in those cities. And this is not to mention the budget problems poorer regions experience 10 times worse than Moscow or any other big city. Let's talk about it right now. Let's now look at this problem from a different angle, because military pressure and manpower shortages are only part of the story, while the deeper weakness is that Putin's war machine was always sold as something Russia could afford indefinitely. And now even the behavior of Russian officials suggests that this confidence is disappearing. For years, Putin's image depended on the idea that Russia had enough reserves, enough oil revenue, and enough financial discipline to absorb sanctions, fund the military, cover regional problems, and still somehow keep the average citizen convinced that the state was and still is strong. That image is now becoming extremely much harder to maintain. Officials appear to understand that the federal budget deficit has spun completely out of control, and the cabinet has been given the ability to borrow as much as it can and adjust budget numbers without constantly going back through the normal legislative process. Whatever I just said sounds bureaucratic and it may sound boring, which most likely it is, but it is actually one of the most revealing parts of the whole story, because governments do not ask for more flexible borrowing powers when everything is calm, predictable, and under control. They do it when spending and revenues are no longer matching in a way that can be managed through normal procedure. And even more importantly, they do it when they want to operate in the dark. Because if the true scale of the mismatch becomes too visible, people begin asking extremely uncomfortable questions about what the war is actually costing them. This is where the endless war theory begins to collapse from the inside. Putin's solution had several pillars once again. Most Russians would not feel the consequences directly, mobilization could be avoided, resources would cover the damage, and the public would remain politically passive. But now every single one of those pillars is under extreme pressure. The war is increasingly visible inside Russia, recruitment is becoming harder, budget flexibility is turning into budget tightness, and the public is showing signs of discontent that the official polling system cannot easily capture. This is where Ilya Remeslo and Bonya entered the picture. We spoke about Ilya Remeslo about a month ago. Their cases are fascinating because neither of them represented a traditional liberal opposition, neither of them built a classic anti-war movement, and neither of them looked like the type of figure who could and who should suddenly shake the political conversation across the whole country. Yet, Remeslo's idea of pushing Putin out and Bonya's backlash against harsh digital censorship both resonated with huge numbers of Russians. Enough that the system had to start thinking about Putin's numbers, united Russia's weakening position, and a new electoral strategy before the September upcoming vote. That does not mean Russia suddenly became democratic, and it does not mean that the election will honestly reflect public opinion, but it does mean that the old machinery is producing strange warning signals, because when a single post on so-called banned Telegram or so-called extremist Instagram can turn unlikely figures into political symbols, it means that the public is not as loyal, calm, or controlled as the Kremlin wants everyone else to believe. And this is where we circle back once again to the main guy of today's video, mentioned at the very beginning, Alexander Lunin, and why his extremely anti-Putin speech and this duo of videos uploaded to Instagram made such an impact on regular people. This is by far the most important part of today's video, because Lunin is not some polished opposition politician and not the kind of person the Kremlin can easily dismiss as a foreign agent speaking to an audience already opposed Putin. No, he comes from the very world the Kremlin helped normalize. Lunin describes himself as a self-proclaimed pagan, a fan of Nazi insignia, the owner of a questionable medal collection, and the kind of person many decent people would probably try to avoid if they noticed him in a bar. In other words, he's not a comfortable messenger, but that is exactly why his rise is so revealing. If someone like him can address Putin directly, talk about military abuse, describe the system as rotten, warn about an armed revolt, and then receive 15 million views on one video and 5 million views on another one, on a previous address, on Instagram by the way, a platform that supposedly Russia banned early in the invasion, then the story is no longer just about him, it is about the audience. It is about millions of people who are not necessarily liberal, anti-war in the moral sense, pro-Western, or in any other way opposed to imperial language, but people who are tired, angry, suspicious, and increasingly willing to listen to someone who says that the system has betrayed its own people. That is much more dangerous for Putin than criticisms from people he already labeled as enemies. For years, complaints from soldiers, mobilized recruits, drone operators, and military families existed on the margins of Russian media life. People complained about lack of training, abuse by commanders, extortion, and terrible conditions, while independent voices like Michael Nike and outlets like Verska and Astra covered those very stories. But the wider Russian public mostly ignored them. After Prigozhin's failed mutiny, the public also became used to men in military clothing making extremely angry threats. And many people treated those videos as just a background noise from the world that they did not want to participate to understand. But Lunin's timing is extremely different. He did not reveal a completely new truth, but he appeared at the moment when the public was already losing faith in old bargain, when fuel problems, drones, recruitment fears, censorship, anger, and political fatigue were all starting to overlap. That is exactly why his words landed so differently. He became a symbol of something bigger than his own personality, because when someone openly talks about an armed revolt and millions of people respond with curiosity instead of rejection, that tells us that the emotional temperature inside the system has already changed. A year ago, for example, many people believed Putin might not win the war in any real sense, but he could still keep it going forever. Now, that belief is much weaker, because he is facing budget stress, political cracks, weakening public loyalty, and viral anger from the same militarized world that once helped decorate the war with patriotic mythology. That is the part the Kremlin should fear the most, because when your opponents criticize you, this is just normal politics, but when your own created reality starts turning against you, when people who once believed in strength begin describing the system as betrayal, and when millions are willing to listen, then the problem is no longer just external pressure, it is internal corrosion. Putin built his long war strategy on the idea that Russia could absorb more pain than anyone else. But the real question now is whether the Russian system can absorb the kind of pain that no longer stays quiet and no longer stays loyal. And based on what we are seeing right now, that question is becoming more urgent every single week. So guys, if you want to keep following these deeper shifts inside Russia, not just the headlines, not just battlefield updates, but the internal cracks that may shape what is happening next, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to